Hello, welcome everyone. Give people a minute or so to get let in, get their audios connected. So good to see everyone. Welcome. All right, welcome to the opening session of Build Peace 2021. We are excited to have you here, and we're excited to have you here through the week. I'm Julie Hawk, and I will be your tech support during the session. So if you need anything, feel free to chat me directly. But the main stars here are, we have Gichuhi from the Build Up team. We have Kentse Radebe from the Bertha Center. And they're here to open the conference, to welcome all of us, to give us a deeper dive into what we can all expect and what the intentions were behind the themes. And we're excited to have them. Here on my screen, you'll see some of our community agreements. These will remain the same throughout the conference. Generally, be curious, build relationships, listen, care for yourself and for others while we're in this online space. If you want to participate with questions, conversation, etc., this is Zoom, as you're all familiar with at this point, and so you can use the chat function to do so. All right, and with that, I will hand it over to Caleb and Kentse.
Well, thank you so much, Julie, and welcome everyone. I think it's good afternoon here, but I know some of you are joining from different parts of the world. So good morning and good evening, and yeah, welcome. And perhaps I can just give Kentse just 2 minutes to say hi before I jump in, so that people at least get to know her. Yeah.
Thanks, Caleb. Welcome to everybody who's joining us from wherever you're joining us in the world. It's so exciting to be here for the second Build Peace conference that the Bertha Center has been involved in. It was so exciting last year to be together, even though we were organizing online. And we're doing the same again this year, but it looks like it's going to be an awesome jam-packed week. So I'm really excited and looking forward to that. And I'm really glad to be joining everybody and being a part of this. As Caleb mentioned and Julie mentioned, I'm based at the Bertha Center, and I'm a project manager in our social systems justice innovation portfolio. And a lot of the work that we do is around convening and bringing people together to have really powerful conversations about social change and social impact. And this is a big part of why we're so deeply invested in the work that Build Up does. So I'm really looking forward to this session, Caleb. I think there's so much to unpack.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kentse. As Kentse mentioned, we shall be having different sessions throughout the week. But to kick us off, we just wanted to have a few reflections and have a discussion around that, because as most of you know, for the theme for this year, is Computer Says No, reflections on digital adaptations, digital conflict, and the long-term impacts of the pandemic on peace building and social justice. So that's a mouthful, and there's need to sort of unpack that and just share our experiences, so that you also get to learn from that and also share with us what what you're thinking about. So I'll just kick us off, and perhaps one of the things when I think about digital adaptations and what the pandemic, the impact of the pandemic has had on our work as peace builders, or even myself as an individual, is for me, I look at it from different dynamics or different areas. So one is that there's been a shift of people from offline to online spaces, but perhaps it's not more of a shift. It's more like spending more time on digital space. So we've seen from the pandemic, when it hit, we saw this move of people shifting their work, because we had access to digital platforms way before the pandemic, right? But then this shift happened, and it's like digital spaces have now been embedded in our lives. And an example is how the impact of the Facebook shutdown that happened recently across the world, and we saw what that did. For example, in Nigeria, e-commerce was brought to a standstill, and people were not able to trade and access goods and services because these movement of activities and work into these spaces has made it in such a way that it's ingrained in our work, and the moment it's removed from our spaces, we cannot be able to engage. And but beyond how people have moved into that space is this aspect of peace builders, because I come from the peace building field and also from the tech field. And, we've seen a shift of peace builders move their work into digital spaces. But specifically for me, one of the key interesting things has been the fact that for peace builders, it has been a forced move rather than a delicate thought out process. Because, you'll find organizations that were not working in the digital space started to move after COVID hit, and it felt like they were forced to move there just because they wanted either to continue their work or access more resources, or that's where the donors were funding. But all these dynamics created this space where peace builders sort of felt like they had to jump in and figure their way out before trying to determine, do we really need to go to that space before jumping into it? And being in that space as peace builders, for me personally, what I've seen is, just this realization of conflict dynamics, because, it's like you come into this space and, you've seen how it's being used by other actors, to engage and, to uplift others and, create a space where people have a voice. But then there is this other element of the digital conflict side that, we are coming to terms with. And another, observation for me has been, there's been an increase on the number of programs that focus on training on digital work. So for peace builders specifically, like training on digital peace building, digital mediation, how to use digital tools. So it's like we are moving into this space, but because we do not understand it fully, we have to train ourselves to understand how to navigate those spaces. Because like I said, for me, it felt like it was a push into that space without having really thought, what do we need to learn? You'll find, training courses have ballooned, in different spaces, and people are learning. And, you'll find online courses to adapt digital tools to peace building work. And, and then you find that, people are shifting towards social media monitoring spaces. People want to understand what's happening in this space. And if you think about that, just the fact that we are moving into this space and we are learning at the same time, we're bound to make mistakes, right? Because it's like you're learning something and implementing it in real time. And it's not like you're in a sandbox where you can experiment first and then deploy. But, people are running, deploying campaigns or, to counter misinformation, to counter hate speech. And it feels a bit clunky because we are still in a learning space. And then the other aspect of this movement to this space has been on a personal level, where, spending hours in front of a computer or looking at, you move from a Zoom call, then you monitor hate speech on social media, and then you look at gruesome images, and it has an effect on a person just because of how they're interacting with that conversation. Recently, even Google introduced a counter to show you how many times you're spending on Zoom calls or in meetings, right? And it's perhaps to try and show you and put it out there for you to understand that you're spending a lot of times online, a lot of hours online, and perhaps it's that, you need to plug out or plug in or shift focus or just focus on other things. But from me, the reflections of the pandemic and how it has sort of created this shift of movement into a digital space, has been happening on those three levels. And one of the questions I keep on asking myself has been, for peace builders, we are seeing the impact of this move. We are seeing peace builders, for example, adopt social media monitoring tools to understand, how hate speech is trending over time or how misinformation about COVID is spreading. But I guess the question to ask here is how that shift, the impact it's having on peace itself, rather than, not the work. The work, yes, we are doing the work, and, some of us also being affected doing that work. But what has the impact been on peace? And is it increasing tolerance? Is it increasing intolerance? Because it has this duality of there are positives to social media and then there are negatives to social media. So how is that impacting, the spaces we work in as we're trying to push our activities and our interventions on peace building? And to reflect on that, I look at social media platforms as structures of power, right? And when you think about how social media can be a structure of power, you start thinking about, elements like agency or equality or, voice, and try to figure out is it increasing equality or decreasing or pushing for inequality, or is it stifling some voices and increasing some voices, based on either context or geographies and all these elements, and how are they affecting the peace that we're trying to achieve? So last week I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine, and we're trying to think about, as peace builders, as you're thinking about this as a structure of power, and it's a structure of power, and we already moving into that space. One of the elements is, we think, as we move into these spaces and these structures function the way they were designed to function, either to maximize engagement or profits, they sometimes tend to amplify the elements that are always in contrast to what we're trying to push out. So there is this tension that sits between the peace building work that we're trying to push and what the systems were set up to do. So by default, actors will put out content that is more, perhaps gets more traction or has a wow factor, and that is a content that perhaps will get amplified. And then we on the other side trying to work against that content, right? And we are working in a space where the structures are set up and the tensions that are sort of pulling us from one side to the other side. But then it's not even about the population that is on social media platforms, but rather how the systems are set up. And if you think about authoritarian states and how they are set up, there are laws that push against, peace building or social development. And if you're always trying to work against them, then you're of course trying, you're going to perhaps even fail, because you're not, it's like set up against you. So my reflections overall, if you think about it from a macro perspective, is how peace builders are moved into this space without, having to perhaps even strategize, how these structures are set up and what they are doing to the type of work we're trying to push. And I know there are some parallel discussions with social media companies on how to address that. But, for ourselves, before even getting to that space, perhaps it's a reflection on, do we need to continue what we're doing at the same way we are doing it, or do we need to take a pause and reflect on that? And Kentse, I just like to hear from you, because I know, you have a different approach to these things. And, while I look at it from the broader aspects, you might have from the work that you're doing, you hone in and, you have a, more granular look into these things. And I'd love to hear your perspective around that.
Thanks, Caleb. You've painted quite a vivid picture, and there's a lot of questions that you've shared that I think are so powerful, and that we spoke about, when we were thinking about what do we want some of the conversations in this particular, Build Peace 2021 to center around. And I think a big part of that has been around the fact that we had this crisis that was the pandemic that really shifted and changed our ways of organizing. So I think as you and I are having this conversation, I'd also love to hear from the audience, so drop any reflections or questions that you have in the chat box, because I think we're hoping that once we've shared some of our reflections, we can engage with some of the experiences that maybe you guys are also bringing into the space. So I want to take a little bit of a step back, Caleb, and maybe reflect on something that I was thinking quite deeply about, thinking about being based in South Africa. So I'm in South Africa, I'm in Cape Town. And when we look at the history of social movements, social justice movements in this country, from the anti-apartheid movement to, the treatment action campaign, fighting for access to HIV medicine, thinking about some of the movements we've seen lately around housing, access to justice, etc. All of those have been movements that really were focused on people engaging together physically, being in the same space. You look at our trade union movement, organizing on the shop floor. All of these ways of organizing, the tactics, the practices, the principles and our ways of working were really informed by being together, connecting in really particular kinds of ways. And then I think about sort of what happened to parts of those social movements during the pandemic, and how, as you were saying, there was almost like this external shift that forced us to think really differently around how we were organizing. And I think for me, I see it in two parts. And the one part is sort of thinking about these ecosystems that we exist in, right? And one of the things that we talk about a lot in sort of like our systems work is how sometimes we do get to a space of rigidity, where we're really comfortable with our ways of working. They sort of service a lot of the missions that we have. And sometimes there isn't any space to have something different, because we're able to achieve so much with the tools and practices that we've perfected, whether it's been for like decades. And I think the pandemic almost created this external shift that we had no control over. And I think what's really exciting about that is that maybe it brings to the surface aspects that we hadn't thought about around power and agency. Questions about who do we leave behind when we organize, whether we're organizing offline or whether we're organizing face-to-face. And I think some of the very questions that you were posing to us really are framed around that. So I really am excited by what this means for our ways of working, and what this means for the ways that we choose to engage, and really thinking quite deeply about power, about social change, and about how we engage. And I think for me, as you were saying, at the granular level, one of the ways that that was really sort of thrust or put right, sort of like as a headline, was here in Cape Town, how community action networks, which didn't exist, prior to the pandemic, but really represented this localized, community-focused form of organizing, where people came together and right before lockdown, which was announced here in South Africa in March 2020, were thinking about, well, we've seen what's happening across the world. We're seeing what's happening in Italy. We're seeing what's happening in the US. We know the social inequalities that are present in our communities. I mean, in South Africa, we know that over 50% of households are living below the breadline, right? So what's a lockdown going to mean for people's jobs, for food security, for safety, for really real questions about how people live day to day? And we knew that even though we had this coordinated national response, it wasn't really filtering down to our communities in the same ways. So for example, one of the issues that we were looking at some of the informal settlements or peri-urban areas here was how a lot of those informal settlements don't have access to water. And one of the big messages coming from the Department of Health was, wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands. So the Community Action Network sort of rose up as this response to say, well, if we're living in this particular context, what kind of messaging and information and support do we actually need to adequately respond to the pandemic? So we organized on Facebook, we organized on WhatsApp, and it was really amazing to watch people who previously in Cape Town might have not engaged for a variety of reasons, race, class, physical distance. I mean, even though apartheid ended nearly 2 decades ago, spatial apartheid and sort of how our city is designed means that people are really segregated according to race and class. So community action networks presented the space where all of a sudden that didn't exist. So you could get onto your WhatsApp group and think about, well, what information do I have that I could share with a different community member that might help them in their ways of organizing? How do we translate a lot of the content that was coming out in English into these other various languages that are relevant to people? So we really saw solidarity and mobilizing in really powerful and useful ways. But I think in the exact same ways as you were saying, that we had all these amazing positive examples of what online organizing can look like, very quickly, we also saw the negative impact of that, because when you're organizing a community online, you don't have the ability to have the nuance of meeting somebody, of understanding, of being able to reframe and rephrase. And we saw a lot of sort of interesting aspects around issues of like power, race, gender coming up on our WhatsApp groups. And I think one of the most powerful things that we had was the structure and form of organizing that we had created, was creating a space where we could have the WhatsApp groups online, but we were also engaging on Zoom. So we were able to some degree to engage with different community representatives, if you will, to share some of our own experiences and learnings. And one of the things that came out of that was creating sort of like principles and values around how we wanted to organize online. Now, I'll be the first to admit and say that a lot of these were actually really idealistic. So they were really painting a picture of, well, in an ideal world, what are the ways that we think that we want to engage with one another? And there were 3 main points that we really pulled out. So the first one was this idea of focusing on critical connections, because we understood that relationship and people was actually key and primary to the work that we were doing. So even though many of us hadn't met face to face, we understood that the mission and what had brought us together was this idea of recognizing that we wanted to do for our own communities. So in sort of putting that front and center, whenever we would engage in maybe a difference of opinion or thinking about different strategies of attacking a particular issue, we'd always come back to the, but why are we here? And I think a lot of that actually fed into that second part around practicing collective consciousness. So when conflicts did arise, we'd go back to that and think about, well, actually, how do we decenter the I and actually center the we? What does that actually look like? And because everybody was constantly engaging in these principles, you would see even in the Facebook group and the kind of moderation, and I call it self-moderation because this community action network wasn't owned by anyone. It was a flat, non-hierarchical structure. So anybody could engage in any way that they wanted to see fit. So by all of us sort of constantly repeating these ideals, you would actually see people taking them on and reinterpreting them in ways that made sense for them. But it allowed for lack of a better word, self-policing online to happen in really organic and meaningful and, dare I say, authentic ways. And then I think the last thing that we really emphasized as a value was this notion of moving at the speed of trust. Because we knew that we were all coming from really different backgrounds. We knew that all of us were coming with different histories, with different ideas of what it meant to organize online. I mean, we had people who had been sort of staunch trade unionists from like back in the day, and people who for the first time in their lives were organizing online with other people. So evidently, you were gonna have this mishmash, this melting pot of ideas. And this idea around moving at the speed of trust was really around acknowledging that actually, because we have the same mission and this idea of connecting together, let's always assume that that's the spirit that people are coming into the space with. Rather than assuming contention and disagreement, let's assume collaboration and somebody wanting to be in the space. And by letting go of this idea that we are coming here for different reasons, but by emphasizing that we're coming here to try find ways to mobilize resources, to find ways to support each other's initiatives, that idea was really central to our way of working. And we constantly kept repeating these principles. And I think what made them so important for us was that they didn't just exist in like this digital space. I think they really were shifting ideas and hearts and minds. They really captured people in ways that I think we hadn't seen in other forms of organizing in the past, where I think a lot of them were deeply rooted sort of like in the political ideals and narratives that you're trying to change. But when you're building relationships with people online, you really have to emphasize something different. And I think that's what we saw in our space. So I think it became easier to engage with people when we kept prioritizing and really centering those experiences. But I think even in acknowledging that, there were instances where we didn't win, where maybe we had a Facebook post that completely derailed, conversations for the rest of the day. And I think those are questions that we're always going to be sitting with around, well, how do you actually manage engagement and connection in that way? And for us, we were about 20,000 people organizing online on Facebook and on WhatsApp. I can imagine that when you have a much more significant or larger group, that maybe it becomes even more complex. It becomes the dynamics, that it becomes even thinking about how do you manage that? And even the idea of wanting to manage that becomes interesting. So I think for me, it's quite fascinating to think about values and social contracts when you're organizing online. And what does that mean when the movement shifts? Because now in 2021, we're no longer at the height of the pandemic. So a lot of us now have met face to face. A lot of us now are actually building relationships online. And I think for me, that's been one of the biggest takeaways, is that even when you are doing online organizing, and this was unique to our context of starting a movement from scratch, it might be different in other circumstances, is this notion of actually having a balance of the two, of knowing when to utilize online and the power that that gives you, but also recognizing that the face-to-face engagement is equally critical.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing, because I want to pull on a thread there that, when you talk about this link between, what you're doing, with the face-to-face and what you're doing online, and how, for example, you had to create the, sort of ground rules to guide the conversations. And despite that, there were still some, outliers who would just jump in and, or maybe call them spoilers. But, for the most part, for your work, you can perhaps call it a success. And for me, I look at, just when I heard you talk about this element of the offline and how it sort of borrowed into the online, for me, that I think about that, and for sometimes I get very cautious when, actors go into an online space without any of those, social contracts that you talk about that can support and perhaps banking on the ground rules that you're going to set once they're online, and we're already seeing that even with your rules, there were still some tensions here and there that you had to, and for me, when I think about that, I reflect on the fact that media is not new, right? So we had legacy or digital, not digital, but the flagship media existed before. And if you think about how they used to share their information, perhaps, most of this was centralized. They were owned either by governments or some corporations, but to some extent, there was some level of, showing both sides of the story, right? There was some level of rigor with journalists and some level of trying to dig the story before it came out. And the one thing, and that had its advantages and disadvantages. But with social media, that space has been fragmented now, and polarity has been exaggerated. And for now, there's a competition of attention. You have bloggers who have come into this space, right? And they're competing with the mainstream media. And then you have bloggers competing with bloggers, and then you have users competing with users. So it keeps on fragmenting depending on which level you are trying to get that attention. We call it cloud chasing. You've heard that term being thrown out before, right? But with this sort of rush to get competition, to compete, to be the one to break the news, then you find spaces where somebody is perhaps going to throw out a comment at you just to get attention. And that comment goes outside the norms that were placed, right, by even the group that you had set up, or it creates a space where misinformation is likely to thrive as people are rushing to break the news. But now with this, with the technological advancements that we've seen in our society with social media, with bloggers coming up and users are getting access to publishing their own content without having to, for example, use some of the objectivity that journalists used to use in the past. You're finding this imbalance where people are more technologically proficient than their wives. And for instance, then when I am able to get into a social media platform at 15, get onto YouTube, publish a video, and then send it out, just to break the news, without probably thinking about what do I need to check. And if you, for the fact checkers in the room and the journalists, they tell you how much time it takes to analyze a story and to find where it's grounded, but that is one of the window for chasing of likes. But when I think about that, and I start to connect to what you're saying, it's perhaps, that, even when you're going into online spaces and you're trying to set up, structures where people are supposed to engage, there's that lack of wisdom on that space. And that's then you see the rise of programs like, digital media literacy. They're ballooning everywhere because it's like we missed our baby steps before jumping into the online space. Now we have to go back and learn that, no, you don't just share information. You don't just blurt out on Zoom because somebody's saying something and, cast them out. Or, like you don't just consume information because you see it online. And then, coupled with the fact that people are engaging with bots. One of a friend of mine, based in rural Kenya, was surprised when I told them that they were engaging with a bot on a marketing platform, because they kept on telling me these people are so responsive. He just loves talking to them, and they're like on the clock. You send a message, they respond, and he could not believe what I was trying to explain to him, that that's a bot and it's meant to do that, to give you that satisfaction. So creating those dynamics where you don't even know whether you're interacting with a human, then you're sort of, when you're in that space and you're mobilizing people in that space without that awareness, then you end up having this chaotic space where, yes, some things are working, and we try to focus on those and say this is working and it's amazing, but then there's this other side that then tries to hijack the processes that you're making because lack of that wisdom. But people know how to, for example, Zoom bomb, but then where does that come from? Where's the wisdom in Zoom, bombing a Zoom conversation? So I think for me, when I look at that, what you were saying, and the fact that you had this social contract offline, you moved it online, it worked, but then also you started sipping, there were some sips in the cracks, but then you're also trying to fill them out. It kind of makes me think that we are rushing too far to even start to organize online before learning the basics of like what you just said, how do we organize, and does it need to start offline? Because the question then becomes, are we neglecting the need to set a foundational offline process that then can easily maybe perhaps move into an online space and then even back offline? in a seamless fashion, perhaps, and maybe this is ideological thinking, but, it just makes me question, the type of hate, the type of, content we're seeing online, misinformation, it's, people would say, oh, it's the social media platforms that are making it possible, like what I just mentioned earlier, but perhaps there's also a bigger question to be asked on whether we need to be organizing first offline before we come into these spaces. And on that, I'm curious, when we talk about these types of misinformation and hate and basically the intolerant content on social media, what your experience has been, outside the program that you ran, just on a, in your society where you work, without any programming, what you've been seeing, because in Kenya, they're two totally different worlds when you're offline and you're walking down the streets and people are going to work casually in a bus, and then you switch on Twitter and it's a war zone. And you're like, wait, are these two worlds I'm living in? And people are talking about the same issues in your country. And I'd be curious, what your experience has been in South Africa.
So I'm an optimist, Caleb. So I'm not a fan of being too prescriptive around thinking about how we can organize online and what that looks like. I think for me, the optimism comes in maybe recognizing exactly what you're saying, that a lot of these shifts that we're seeing are new. So we are going to have the extremes, the polarization, the misinformation. And I think as society, but also the organizations that are sort of leading the charge in that space are trying to figure out, how do we make online engagement and online mobilizing more effective? And what does that mean? Because I think for me, when we think about the big players in the space, the Facebook, the WhatsApps, etc., wherever people are organizing online, that these are really great tools. And the fact that we don't have, for lack of a better word, rules for how people engage in the space can actually be a good thing for the kinds of social mobilization that we want to do, because it might allow people who maybe before wouldn't have had a space to organize safely to be able to do that online. And I think obviously then the disadvantage, or where I think we're still catching up, is that lag of figuring out, how do we moderate these spaces in really safe ways? How do we curtail misinformation? And I think for me, maybe the COVID-19 pandemic is a really good example of how we could start doing that, because we actually did see the likes of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram become really proficient around labeling fake news, fake information, etc., right? And I think that's one way of starting to do that. And we've seen that in a number of spheres as well, also with political campaigns, more specifically in the US, with Trump's presidency and the impact that that had on, engagement online. So I think that we're learning. So I think that as we learn, we're going to come up with maybe innovative ways and different ways. I think maybe the challenge is that we, in our heads, have the same idea. We think the same ways that we've organized and maybe controlled or managed that offline will be the same ways that we do that online. And I think that perhaps might be where the challenge lies. Let's take, for example, WhatsApp. I remember at the height of the pandemic, a lot of the family groups that I was in was sharing a lot of misinformation about how you could contract the virus, about treatments that you could access, around who was ultimately responsible for this, real conspiracy theories. And what was really amazing about who was sharing these conspiracy theories were people who were like, average people, teachers, family members, friends, etc. And for me, what made it really interesting was that in that space, there wasn't really an opportunity to police, because unlike on Facebook or on Twitter, where that information would be labeled and you'd have a national government link to the correct website, you can't really have that on WhatsApp, right? And we know that if you share information on a WhatsApp group, that actually could reach thousands of people in a really short space of time. And I don't think we've yet figured out what it means then to actually moderate conversations on a space like that. More importantly, for those of us who are coming from parts of the world where we speak more than one language, how do you then moderate misinformation? Like in South Africa, where we speak 11 official languages. A lot of the information that was coming out around COVID was actually in English. There were organizations, and they're doing amazing work, who have translated a lot of that important information into some of the more commonly spoken languages. But I know that in Africa alone, we have hundreds of languages. So what does that look like when you're doing this kind of work in the global south and in really dynamic and complex societies? So I think for me, the question maybe might not be so much around thinking about the rules that we need to create. I think that as we keep moving into the space, we will figure that out. However, the one thing that I will say is that I do think we need to hold these platforms accountable. I think a lot of the times the debate is, well, we don't have control over what people say, or etc. I think the Facebooks of the world, the Twitters of the world, and I think there are already organizations we know who are working in this space who are really sort of pushing back and saying, well, if your platform is creating this level of information, particularly around like elections or the pandemic, then we need to hold you accountable for that, because that has very real world social consequences. And for me, I think that's a more important conversation to have, because that's where people, I think, are going to get some of maybe the protection, or at least some level of the information that I'm getting is valid, and my rights are also being respected, and finding that balance. So I think for me, maybe that's where I see us going in the future.
Yeah, the one concern I have when I hear, when you talk about tech companies and how to hold them accountable, and I have no problem about that, but when from a peace building lens, when you think about how people in like 10 years back, when people would approach a conflict environment or a conflict context, right? There used to be a very deep conflict analysis done to understand who are the actors, who are the players, right? To understand all the different dimensions of who is pushing this content. Is it because there's a politician there? Is it even weather patterns, like we saw in South Sudan, where drought was causing it had a role to play? And to try and understand what is the conflict, who are the actors, how is it being manipulated, and then deploying a campaign or initiative to address that conflict, because now you kind of have a bigger picture of the militia groups, the government-sponsored groups, the youth, everyone who is involved in that conflict. But then you think about it, and you now start to think about, as peace builders, and technology has sort of ballooned into this space where we are in, or rather we've moved into this space of the digital spaces. We are not doing that. And perhaps, and for me, this is just one of the things I was thinking about, is if you think about it, we don't have the tools to do it, to analyze a digital space with a peace builder's lens. And there are some technology tools that exist there, maybe commercial tools that analyze social media networks to tell you which product was selling. The other day I was looking at a platform. It was massive, and it would identify images of Coca-Cola anywhere online and cross-check that with a Google map to tell you where it was taken. It was massive, but that's a product if you think about it. But what we're doing as peace builders, we are co-opting those technologies, and we're trying to use them to understand tensions, because the tools that exist for us to do that work are usually applied offline. And those are the things we used to do before. And now we are moving into this space, and we're trying to navigate that space and hold technology companies accountable, while we don't even see the bigger, the full picture. And beyond that, the data itself is not even available. If you wanted to access that data, let's say that tool you're using was a commercial tool, but you could still access the data, it would give you, you'd have some advantage, because now you're coming closer to getting the full picture. But this data is held by these technology companies. So basically you're arguing, you're putting an argument to them, telling them, you need to stop doing this. And they're telling you, where's your evidence? And it's getting to a point where it's like, you go try to look for this evidence, then come back. And then by that time you're back, social media has changed and a new platform has emerged, and people have moved from that platform you were using. And we're seeing that right now in Myanmar, where people are now edging towards TikTok. And Facebook was the one, that was being held responsible for conflict some time back, right? So if you think about those dynamics that play against someone who's trying to navigate this space, and you're trying to have that conversation, it opens the door first to have that conversation, but I think to some extent it also is creating a space where you're trying to look for data that you not fully understand, to put up an argument with tech companies that have a different agenda. And I'm thinking, for the work that you're doing, and as you're organizing on these spaces, if you maybe had any reflections on, is there any information, perhaps even just mobilizing a group to have, instead of us representing the public to tech companies, but people who are in these spaces, then speaking to tech companies, instead of, I'm Bill Peace, I'm going to look for online information and then take it to Facebook and say, look, you did this. And sometimes you'll see that information and we don't even sometimes know what to make of it. So you'll see misinformation was spreading online, maybe because of COVID, but what does that really mean for peace building? Or what does that really mean for peace? Like, did it increase violence? Did it increase tensions? Or was it just, did it just die somewhere and nobody even, thought it was true? So those are some of the things, when you think about how do we engage even with tech companies, it's like, what do we have that we can say that, okay, this is what is happening, and then try to keep up also with the changes so that it's more relevant, or rather it's relevant, and it's not, even if it's outdated, it's something that can maybe put a ripple in the waters.
Sure, Caleb, you're asking such brilliant and I think really challenging questions that we should actually be asking. And I have to say that I don't think I have answers for all of them, but I think it's one of the reasons why we wanted to convene people together like this to talk about this very particular theme, right? Because during the week, we're going to be covering topics relating to polarization, relating to like social media, relating to cybersecurity and data, and all of these really critical pieces. So I think for me, it's continuing this conversation, because I think even last year, I learned so much from attending all the different sessions and learning about groups that were doing really interesting work. And I wouldn't be surprised that there are actually activists and organizations that are thinking about data and how we access it and what that means for us, particularly when a lot of these platforms are free. Therefore, we know that that data is something we don't have access to. So for me, I think that's really, really powerful. But I think one of the ways that we can start doing that, and not to sound like I'm promoting what we're doing here, but actually bringing people together like this to share information, to share ideas, to think about, well, how might we want to organize differently and strategically, and what resources and powers do we actually have access to? Because I think in as much as, and I think you're very rightly problematizing the platforms that we're utilizing and how we're utilizing them, then for me, there's the other side of when we swing back to then how then do we actually turn that for us in a way that is really productive, in a way that is generative for activists and for people who are organizing on the ground and peace builders across the world. If anything, I think it's amazing how the call that you're making, not just for peace builders in Kenya or in South Africa, that actually we're all faced and grappling with the same questions. Therefore, being able to mobilize online as a group like this globally actually makes our activities more powerful and our voices to actually be more impactful, just beyond our own borders, and thinking about what that looks like. And I think that's even more critical when we think about the power of, the Facebooks of the world, the Instagram, as you were saying, that when that shut down, all of a sudden, all of us were stuck. So I think maybe let me pause there for now, because I know that we have a few questions in the chat box. And I want to start with, I think it was Helena's question around the moving at the speed of trust. And it was something that I'd spoken about around the community action networks and what that meant and what that looks like. But I'm seeing a whole bunch of questions. So let me try to go to the top so I can actually find that question. Oh, there we go, right there. So your question, Helena, was what I hinted at just now. How do we scale constructive engagement across an entire social media platform and work towards drowning out the polarization? And I completely agree with you, Helena, that the way that our platforms are organized, and I think this is exactly what you were saying, Caleb, is that they're actually organized in a way to not be constructive, to create these echo chambers, because that's what fuels the engagement. And I think we saw that with Trump's campaign as well, and how his campaign utilized social media. So I think this is a fantastic question, Helena. And one of the lessons that we actually got out of that was, especially because we were organizing on WhatsApp, and you would have one group with like 200 people. What we actually ended up doing was organizing those 200 people into thematic groups and organizing into smaller groups. So you would move away from the bigger, so we used to call it like the admin group. So the neighborhood you were in would have the main admin group, and then there'd be different offshoots, and they'd be covering different things like, food security, mental health, etc., unemployment. And in moving some of those conversations away from the bigger group, created an opportunity for people to actually have smaller conversations. So I think for us, that was an interesting lesson, but it does pose interesting questions then for how do you do the same piece of work on Twitter? Because I don't know what that looks like. and ultimately, we've seen how conversations on Twitter can devolve into the polarized kinds of conversations where you lose the nuance and the meaning in between. I think, and I point to Twitter because that's probably where I spend most of my time, what we're seeing with the inclusion of tools like Spaces is maybe one way we can start doing that. So spaces, for those of you guys who aren't on Twitter, is you can pull people together almost like it's almost like a Zoom call on Twitter. You can think about it that way, and you can join. And there you might have like hundreds of people joining, and you could just have 5 people joining. And I think one of the ways that maybe we can start doing that is mobilizing for our social media platforms to create spaces where you can have those more direct engagements with people. I don't think it answers the bigger question of how you organize online in a meaningful way and how you scale that up. And maybe the question is, should we even want that? I think for me, that's the question that I'm sitting with, and what that means. But yeah, I think that's one way that we found to work for us, because by the time people move into the bigger groups, they've had opportunities to feel heard. They've had opportunities to learn from other people in really slow ways. And I think that's something else that we learned, is that this work is not fast. This work is actually slow. And a lot of the ways that we engage online is actually really fast, and we tend to leave people behind. And that's what also creates the frustration and the inability to make a mistake and ask questions and to be corrected in a really safe way.
Yeah, Kentse, I like how you explain that, and it also reflects on one of the things we were trying to discuss the other day on when you shift conversations on social spaces, what do you compromise, you know? And as long as we are aware, you know, as we try to be aware of these movements of offline and online, you know, when we know what we're leaving behind, then we're a bit more aware of, okay, this is how we need to address that. Otherwise, we keep on emphasizing the same digital divisions or digital divides, where we've moved now our space online. Now we're working just online, but that information is not feeding into you know, offline spaces. And it reminds me of work we were doing in Kenya, where we brought in students who are working in an online space, you know, to depolarize conversations with offline peace builders, and to have a conversation. And at first, they did not click. You know, it wasn't clear what was happening for both parties. It was until they started talking about the narratives, and that's where they saw the connection. Because these narratives shift back and forth. You know, they don't live on digital spaces or offline spaces. They're constantly in movement as people find ways to express themselves, or, you know, to push a certain agenda, depending on the spaces they are. So once they saw that space, that there's a narrative that we've been hearing offline, and we're now seeing it online, started to click, okay, now this is how we can connect. We can learn, we can, you know, perhaps even explain to you how this narrative came to be, because it started in an offline space. You know, somebody had COVID and it became like a whole big thing and trended online, and it became, you know, and now it's making back, you know, its way into offline spaces. But yeah, it's always this question of what are we leaving behind? So I think even for the practitioners who are here, as you go through the conference, you know, start to think of, as you know, engaging in digital spaces, you know, what are you leaving in the offline spaces? And, you know, is there a link between these two spaces that can then inform your work in both spheres, you know, such that we're not, again, prioritizing online because, you know, it's either, yeah, for different reasons.
Sure.
Right.
There's a question from Bill Waters that I'm looking at right now that I think it's intrigued me. And Bill, I'm wondering if you can unmute. I know that our tech team has said that they've given everyone permission to unmute. And I'm wondering if you could unpack that question a little bit for the audience, and maybe some of the context that you were thinking about as you were framing that question for us.
Well, thank you. I think that conflict analysis is really key. And Caleb was calling out how to be a effective conflict interventionist, you need to be aware of who the parties are and what the power dynamics are. And I think in social spaces and digital spaces, we have different kinds of actors. We have chatbots, we have you know, corporate algorithms. We have a lot of different factors, and maybe some new actors that are paid actors who are, you know, manipulating spaces. And so I think that we don't want to give up on conflict mapping and conflict analysis as we try to do peace building. I think Caleb's point was it moves so fast that it's hard to, you know, you're reactive more than proactive. You're always catching up. So I was looking for the wisdom of this group as to what are some of the things we should watch and how we might, you know, build conflict maps that are useful in these fast moving spaces.
Absolutely. And I think for me, it's important to have that framing in mind. And I think some of the conversations that we'll be having around that, I was actually looking at the rest of the sessions and workshops and short talks that we have, I don't want to forget those questions, because I think in part of the conversation that Caleb and I have been having hasn't really thought about some of those pieces. And I'm noting it because I think it would be important to also raise up in the other sessions that we're having. Thanks so much for that comment, Bill Waters. Caleb, I don't know if there's any other questions that maybe we want to touch on. I know, Helena, you'd said some really, really interesting things around research and incentivizing Facebook and other platforms. And I'm wondering if maybe you can also maybe comment a little bit on that. And I think it was the comment that you had around who shifts the policies in the space and maybe what else we should be thinking about.
I'm happy to say something more. I think I've just I struggle with the fact that there's a lot of thinking going into, what could be the redesign of algorithms to, to really be able to scale that. I said there's always stumbling blocks in the way of scaling these more constructive conversations on social media. And the stumbling blocks I was referring to were largely the design of algorithms, right? And the kind of content that gets amplified. And so somebody posted a really interesting link to this AI ethics research, and there's loads of AI ethics research that tries to unpack, okay, what would it take to actually scale these constructive behaviors that we see in smaller social media groups, as you were describing, Kentse, right? Like, what if we took your 3 principles, what would it take to algorithmically design a space where that would happen? And I think that's great, but it feels so abstract to me when there is such a strong financial incentive to do the exact opposite, because what increases engagement really easily is polarization and polarizing content. And so whenever that comes up, I just can't help myself but say, first, you've got to break that financial incentive, and then that research might become actionable. I think that's all I was trying to say. The link is really interesting that Michelle Giovanardi posted. You should all look at it too.
No, thanks.
Just a quick response, and I love looking at such articles and seeing what type of research is being done out there. The question I always come back to is, what does this mean for peace builders? What does it mean for peace? Because I know Julie, we shared some article about Twitter setting up a group that was meant to address polarization, but then that group, they also found that the group was also polarized in itself. So then the question is, wait, okay, this is all great, and we're uncovering this, but if we can create that link between this type of research that is happening and is groundbreaking and it's amazing, to how does this affect our work, and does it mean that you remember that when you think about structures of power, like, does it amplify voice, or does it stifle it? Then we can start now to navigate those spaces with that type of research, and even maybe perhaps have that conversation with these tech companies, because we are seeing that link.
Thanks, Caleb. I see that there's more and more comments and engagements. I'm loving the links that everybody's sharing in the chat box, so I deeply appreciate that. But Caleb, I just thought, as we're coming up to the top of the hour, it will be great, because I know, Judy, we're having a second session after this, and I was wondering if maybe we could frame that for the audience, because I think the conversation that we've had here as part of this opening session is just really a tip of the iceberg for the various conversations that we're going to be having throughout the week. And we really wanted to just set the scene and maybe paint the picture a little bit for the kinds of spaces that we'd like to create, whether it's with the keynote addresses, the short talks or opportunities for engagement. But thank you for joining us. I think for me and Caleb, it's been such a fascinating conversation. And even with the notes that we prepped, we've only touched some of the pieces that we wanted to talk about. So I think it's amazing that we've been able to do that. But Judy, let us hand over to you to maybe just give context for the next session. And thank you for everybody who's joined us. It was wonderful to engage.
Thank you.